from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are most fortunate to have with us for the next 2 weeks a representative that represents the National Education Association, the Idaho Education Association, to talk about civil and human rights, a very, very important subject. I welcome to the program Sue Hanson-Barber, who is a teacher in the Wallace School District in Idaho. She's a coordinator of special development programs, but she's here today in the capacity as the chair of the Human and Civil Rights Committee of the Idaho Education Association. Sue, welcome to the program. I've watched your work and I'm so impressed with what you and IEA and NEA do in this field.
Thank you.
And also in going through this process, I want to quote a paragraph that Sue has brought us that I think really sets the tone for both this week and next week in this two-part series. They have said in their publications that the United States prides itself in being a democratic society with strong traditions of justice for all. Civil and human rights are basic tenets of American life. We are proud that the Bill of Rights in our Constitution has established freedoms unknown in many other parts of the world. And many of us have worked very hard to ensure that our rights and freedoms extend to groups which have historically been the victims of discrimination and prejudice, particularly on the basis of religion, race, ethnic identity, and sex. We understand that the protection of the rights of any one of us depends on protection of the rights of all of us, end of quote. So I think that sets a wonderful tone for what your committee does in its work. I would remind our viewers that in dividing this in two parts, in the first program we're going to talk about the whole field of civil and human rights as it's been addressed by these two organizations. And then next week we'll come back to you and talk about Sue's work with workshops in which we particularly address with teachers and counselors how to deal with prejudice reduction. With that background, I welcome to the program two members of the panel. To my immediate left is Jenelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she is the law clerk for the First Judicial District Chief Judge. And next to her is Lloyd Marsh, who's on the faculty at North Idaho College, teaching in the field of the physical sciences. And welcome to both of you, and I would ask Jenelle to commence the questioning.
Sue, could you tell us a little bit more about what exactly are the committees that you serve on? What are their purposes?
Okay. The Idaho Education Association began being involved in human and civil rights way back when it was noted under a different label, which was the Negotiations and Contracts and Rights Committee. And what they found from that committee was that the area of human and civil rights was much too large to encompass in a committee that also had to deal with teachers' negotiations and teachers' contracts and other things of that nature. So in 1989, they began to look at the idea of having a committee, a Human and Civil Rights Committee for the IEA. And at that point, they had an interim committee that they put together to explore what kinds of issues that they would be looking at, what kinds of programs we could put together as far as human and civil rights. And in 1990, the Delegate Assembly voted to have a committee, a standing committee of its own right in human and civil rights. And one thing that I should say about both organizations, the NEA and the IEA, is that committees always start because of some grassroots movement. It comes because of a group of teachers say, this is an issue that we need to address, and that is where those committees come from. In the NEA, it's very much the same as the IEA, the national organization, and that is that if there's an issue that comes up, say somebody has an issue with prejudice reduction or an issue of multicultural education. It comes from a group of teachers who say this is what we need to do, and they bring it to the representative assemblies where we all gather, and from that come new business items which are action-oriented, and also comes resolutions, which are things that the organization believes. And from those, these committees have been formed, and that's how the IEA got involved in human and civil rights. So since 1990, we have had a program of human and civil rights through the committee.
What is the purpose of the committee then? I think you went into that just a little bit. One is the resolution. So it's to determine where the the entire association stands on an issue. It's to
Right.
gain a consensus, I take it.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens to those resolutions?
Well, resolutions are the philosophy of the organization, so they're kind of used as the backbone. From the resolutions comes new business items, which are action-oriented, and that's where we take what will become our programs for the year. And in human and civil rights, what has come from that is that we've ended up with programs of developing resources for teachers to use. We are looking at workshops, which we'll be discussing later, different types of workshops, and it has come in the form of giving us ideas about putting together grants so that teachers can implement different kinds of projects in their classroom. And so those are some of the things that we do.
Lloyd Marsh.
Yes, just thinking about it, there's so many organizations, well, maybe not enough, but organizations that deal with civil rights, the ACLU and organizations, but I would imagine that your committee, your organization focuses on education issues and specifically on the curriculum. Is that,
Yes.
or can you expand on
Yes,
that?
yes. We do go from the education aspect, and many of the things that you're talking about, one of the things that we have realized is that in human and civil rights issues, it's such a global field that everything we do in the classroom, or many things that we do in the classroom, are affected by human and civil rights issues, and are parts of human and civil rights issues. So we have looked at different curriculum. We have developed curriculum materials specifically at this point for different holiday and certain celebration types of things. We do have materials that we've made available for teachers for the Martin Luther King Day celebrations, for Women's History Month, for Black History Month, for Japanese Day of Remembrance, for Cinco de Mayo, and most recently for the quincentennial of Columbus, and some of the issues that came up surrounding the teaching of Columbus Day. At this point, we are working toward curriculum that would be across all ages and across all subjects, and that's something that we are working on as a committee and hope to develop in the next few years.
So in the future, we would expect to see a state mandated curriculum that would address human and civil rights?
I would hope that we would get to that point. Yes, we've been talking some to Washington State, who does have a curriculum, a K through 12 curriculum in multicultural education, and so that is one of our goals, long-term goals, because that's quite a project.
And while we're on this subject, that Lloyd has built a bridge for me, which he does quite often when he's on the program. We hear a lot around the United States today about multicultural curriculum, but now we see that some of the states that are most advanced in this whole process talk about that has been a learning process and a first step towards a more effective program called pluralism and diversity. Would you like to address that? Aren't we, as we develop curriculum there as in other areas, learning a lot ourselves about that it can be much more developed?
Yes, and one of the things that we have, to say what Lloyd had brought up, one of the things that we have discussed, has been part of our discussions, is the fact that there is quite a debate going among educators and among many people about the use of multicultural education versus one on pluralism and diversity versus anti-bias curriculum and just prejudice reduction, which can be found in curriculums from K to 12 in all three of those different kind of arenas. And that's one of the places where we've been, and a lot of what we've been doing in our committee in the last couple of years is to explore what are the needs of people who are in the field. What are teachers saying? What are the pressing problems? And what would help them? What kind of curriculum would be helpful? And then also to discuss what has been the big debate about what type of curriculum do you want to work on, so that you don't work on a curriculum for 2 or 3 years and find out this doesn't suit what people are looking for.
Really, you're pioneering in this area. I've done some studies around the United States in conjunction with the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, and there's really not a lot that's been developed. I mean, there's some special pilot projects, but am I not correct to say that we really are just opening the door to curriculum development?
Oh, I think so, most definitely. And what we've discovered is that there are little pockets of things in every area that you'd like to pull together to be the entire curriculum, and that's really where we are at this point. One of our big tasks over the last year was just pulling together curriculum and pulling together coalitions with many other diverse groups who are working in this area of human and civil rights, so that we don't end up developing a new wheel, but using what's already available.
Sue, I'm not trying to talk for you, but I thought I heard you say, if I talk to people, some people, they're advocating multicultural programs, others are saying, no, it must be pluralism and diversity. And you said we're in 3 arenas. Did I hear you say that all of those have a part to play in the curriculum development?
Oh, I think so. And from our discussions, that's what we found, is that there are places where we're overlapping. There are places where the people with multicultural education, really pushing that, are saying, well, yes, but we do need to address the idea of diversity globally, and yes, we need to address anti-bias and conflict resolution types of arenas. Sure. Also.
One final thing, and then I'll go back to the panel, because this curriculum issue is really important, I think. That is, we have some viewers that are just being introduced, I'm sure, that are not in the teaching field. And could you give them a little bit of definition or difference between, for example, multicultural and the programs in pluralism, diversity?
Okay. Multicultural is that, my understanding is that you're looking at different pockets of culture and teaching about that culture so you would spend some time with the Hispanic culture, and you would spend some time teaching about the Black culture, Afro-American culture. And you would do that with each culture and do it as a separate unit type of teaching. And in pluralism and diversity, that you teach about the concept of diversity and the concept of pluralism, and not necessarily, segment those out into teaching about the different ethnic diversity that we have, but diversity as a whole and pluralism as a whole.
And in the pluralism and diversity, it gets into things like the Bill of Rights and why we tolerate differences in speech and press and assembly and so forth.
Right. And I think that we're also looking at that becoming a bit more global and not being centered on the United States per se, but a global perspective. And then the other part that we've looked at, other arena, is the conflict resolution and anti-bias, which is a whole another thing about when you look at, okay, you can believe that there is diversity and agree that we need to learn about diversity, but also to begin to look at then how do we deal with differences, and what are our ways of communication and dealing with people with differences.
Thank you very much. That was very eloquently put. Jenelle Burke.
I want to go to the classroom now, and there are really 2 components in the classroom: the students and the teacher. But let's start with the students. And what do you find as students get older? Do they develop greater biases? Do they develop more prejudice? And do you need to work on that as they grow older?
It was interesting. I attended at the Northwest Coalition Conference last year in Boise. I attended a workshop done by Sally Pena, who works in early childhood and works with anti-bias in early childhood. And one of the things that she said at that workshop was that children develop that idea of difference between age 2 and 3, and that's something that a child develops at that point, and that continues throughout their life. So when we talk about the importance of education, I think we can't stress enough the importance of that from preschool on. It's not something that at 16 you suddenly decide, oh, I didn't like that person over there because he's different. I think that's something that we begin with as a young child, and that's something we should be dealing with throughout education.
And how much difference is there in? Can you make a difference if you educate with regard to bias and with regard to prejudice?
I believe we can. From I don't have any statistics at hand about what happens with groups of children who've had early childhood education in that realm. But from what I can gather from things I've read and people that I've talked to, yes, it does make a difference. When we looked at places where conflict resolution and cooperative learning is happening in the elementary grades, I think we see children coming out of there that are tolerant of differences, that respect differences in people, and who know how to deal with them. when they get into high school and beyond.
Now, the other thing that's going on is the teacher, and how does the teacher react to that? Do you need to work with the teachers as well? Because all of us come into this life with, and into our jobs, with our backgrounds. What can you do for the teacher?
That's a very important part of that, and I think that anything we do in the area of curriculum or in any of that is not going to make one iota bit of difference if the teachers do not believe in what they're teaching, and if they are not, if they do not get the training to be in the same place that the children would be when they're teaching. And I think that's why our workshops and the things that we're trying to provide through the IEA and through the NEA are so important, because they provide some of that training and some of that background to teachers, and that buy-in to this is important for a student.
Lloyd Marsh.
Well, I'd like to take that question just one step further. We've heard a lot during this last political campaign about the presence of the family and the importance of the family. And you can have children in a classroom and train the teachers and train the children, but have you targeted the family? Have you targeted the parents? What can we do with them?
That's true. We should be doing that. You're right. You're right. And in school restructuring, much of the discussion right now is on the involvement of the family in the education process across all lines. And I think that's something that in schools we are struggling with. One of the projects that we have put together at the IEA in the HCR committee is a grant process where we're asking teachers to submit grants. And one of the things that we're working with them on is involving not only the family but the community in the writing of their grant and in the implementation of their grant. And in putting those kinds of projects together so that it's not just the school putting that together, but somebody, other people who are working on that. So I do think that's important.
Yeah, that's good too. I have another question that's related to that. I remember as a child, and I assume they still do in the K-12 programs, talk about the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And those are words that have to be given a lot of meaning in your program. I think when we talk about the Pledge of Allegiance and the rights of the individual, that has to be extended into the area of human and civil rights.
Yes, it
and
is.
It's just not words that we're saying, that the children memorize and say every day, but to have no meaning.
Right, right. Right.
We've been talking a lot about curriculum and what happens in the classroom, and Lloyd has built that bridge into the parents and making it a more all-encompassing process. But in our opening questions, you indicated that the IEA and NEA in this field of civil and human rights are involved in other things, of course, and one of those is in the field of legislation. And I happen to be rather close to one of your projects when the IEA, as they always do, decide what are their priorities in legislation, not only budgeting items but other things. And one of the things that you did in 1990 was put almost at the top of your list the Martin Luther King state holiday bill for the state of Idaho, and it was your staff and resources that was on a daily basis working for weeks and weeks in that process. I would like for you to give us your reaction to that experience and other things that you have done in the field of public policy as it relates to your committee.
Okay. I have to say that for the most part, when the legislation was happening for the Martin Luther King holiday, our committee was not really formed at that time. We were in the interim state. So much of that work, I would have to credit to Kathy Yamamoto, who was working as our director at that point, and who is our liaison to our committee from the staff. And she did, a lot of work, I know, and worked many hours with legislators in Idaho to make that legislation pass. And we all thought that was something that had to happen. I mean, that was a priority, and I feel very proud that the IEA took that as a priority and worked as hard as they did to have that legislation pass. It was wonderful.
But am I not correct, Sue, that not only in the organization here but in others around the country, Washington Education Association, I know, has been very, very involved with legislation. So doesn't the National Education Association encourage the state organizations to get involved in not only such legislation, which has really been basically complete except for 2 states on the King holiday, but you're very involved in even being supportive. And I know you were helpful in Idaho in what we call the anti-hate crime legislation
Right.
to try to protect individuals who become victims of hate crimes.
Right.
So could you elaborate a little bit in that area?
The NEA provides a lot of technical assistance to states who would like to, or states who are embarking on different projects, legislative projects, and they do provide the assistance and they do provide the expertise a lot of times for people to be able to do those kinds of things,
And so that comes part of your lobbying process too, doesn't it, in the state
Right.
legislature? Because it takes a lot of lobbying for those bills to be successful.
Right. And in IEA, we've been able to bring things to the legislative process through the GR PACE committee, because we have another committee under the IEA. And what happens there is that the same thing that we talked about earlier, it's a grassroots movement. So if people believe, a group of people believe that something should be brought to the legislative attention, then it can be submitted to the IEA and they can make a determination about putting it as part of their legislative package. And what we found is that this past year, one of the big ones that's come up is censorship and the issues that have happened in Meridian and some other places in southern Idaho. And that's one that's now become part of the legislative package and will be addressed when it goes to the legislature, because that's part of IEA's policy and the way they work, because it has come from a group of people who've said we need to do that. So we have a great support through that committee and through that lobbying structure.
One thing I'd like to get across to the viewers that they may not know too, because you referred to it a minute ago, the last 3 years the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment has held conventions. First it was in Spokane and Washington, and then Boise, Idaho, and this year Eugene, Oregon. And in all three of those cases, the State Education Association was a co-sponsor. Of course, in Spokane it was Washington Education Association last year, the Idaho Education Association this year, the Oregon organization, and helping with their resources, their staff for these workshops and the symposiums and the speakers. And so you're reaching out in public policy that way, because a lot of those conferences deal with all kind of public issues, including legislation. So I'm more than in the form of a question commending you for that involvement, which is a really big area of civil and human rights, dealing with malicious harassment.
Yes, and we believe that we cannot do work in the area of human and civil rights alone, that the coalition building is one of the strongest parts of our program, I think, and that's the ability and the need for us to all work together in the area of human and civil rights.
Jenelle Burke.
Sometimes we hear people criticize programs that deal with this kind of thing on the grounds that why do we need to point out differences? Why not make everyone the same? Or why not, and especially in areas such as the area we live in, where there is a fairly homogeneous kind of student in the classroom. Mm-hmm. What do you say to them in response to that?
I think that's very interesting, because we do deal with that all the time, and especially in this area of where the population is so homogeneous. Our response to that has been that until we can value the diversity, we cannot work together, and that's where we come from. That we need to address the issues of diversity and to be able to see and value that we are indeed a melting pot before we can come to terms with how to work together, because there are differences and we need to acknowledge those.
Lloyd.
In the process of implementation, working in the science, you become a nut for data. And I'm just wondering, do you have any channels to acquire data around the state or nationally about violations of human and civil rights? Do you collect that kind of information?
Part of our goals were last year to work on doing that. And one of the ways we have is to go through and build a coalition with the Human Rights Commission. And they have provided us, and the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment has provided us a lot of data to give us ideas about incidents of harassment. We have not been able at this point to develop a system for schools, although we are starting to get to the point where people are coming to us and saying, this has happened in my school, and this has happened in my school, and these are incidents that are happening. And we need to develop that because we are seeing that more and more. And at first it was, I think we were so taken aback by the number of incidents that we heard that it was like we didn't even think about, well, you know, we need to keep track of this. And now we're at the point of saying, yes, we do. We need to have our own system.
Right, because as soon as we begin to talk about legislation to support this, I think we need evidence of a need for legislation,
Right.
and that's something that has to come from the grassroots,
Yep.
the people that are out there experiencing these kind of.
And I think now that our committee has been around for a year, people are saying we know who to contact. And now we are getting reports from school districts and newspaper clippings and calls from parents and calls from other people saying this is happening. And so we are getting some of that.
I can add a footnote to that process in that the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, which is really old, it came into being in February 1981, and the Northwest Coalition, now your committee. Now, after you've been around a little while, it's interesting how many people will learn about your existence, and they automatically will be in touch with you with data that Lloyd is talking about, and also asking for assistance or help or recommendations. To add one point, that there was a survey done in Idaho by Boise State University Research Center for the Idaho Human Rights Commission, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, and in North Idaho, this whole state was broken into regions, and the 5 northern counties was Region 1. And across the state, they asked, who would you contact? And everywhere in Idaho, they would contact the police department or some, usually government entity, except in North Idaho, they indicated they would contact the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. So I think that's real verification of what you're going to experience in IEA. We're just about out of time, Sue, but one quick question we had with you before we went on the air, and that is, obviously, among educators, there's a realization of the need for this and not a lot of resistance, but yet the development of the curriculum is very slow. Could you give us a little quick insight to why that is, taking a time around the country?
I think that teachers mirror the general population in that they bring to their job, just like Jenelle said, their own fears, their own experiences, and I think that we have to break through those barriers with teachers, the same as we do with the general population, to make things happen.
We're about out of time, but one of the things is that since they haven't been trained in that in college, it's a curriculum they're not used to teaching.
That's
like
true.
I wouldn't want to teach chemistry because I haven't had chemistry. With that note, we'll have to bring our permanent conclusion, but Sue, thank you very much on the panel, and the good news is to our viewers that we'll be back with you again next week, and that program we're going to talk about some of the workshops and the real detail of how that goes through a process for counselors and teachers. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us next week for this part 2 on civil and human rights. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.